Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session on AJAX Patterns with ASP .NET. Hope you're having a blast on the first day of MIX. This session is going to be about ASP .NET AJAX and looking beyond the basics, looking at some real-world problems, looking at some solutions, and how you might apply those solutions to your own applications. My name is Nikhil Kothari. I'm an architect on the web platform team, worked on ASP.NET, ASP.NET AJAX, working on Silverlight. So I've been kind of involved in the web platform across the board. As I was describing, this session is about going beyond the basics. So it's not about let's figure out how to use XML/HTTP. We're past that. We're creating real applications with AJAX, and there are some real problems to be solved. And ASP.NET provides a great platform for solving those problems and helping you create great user experiences with your applications. So I thought I'd go look at Wikipedia, and the word pattern is actually very overloaded. So they have a disambiguator, design patterns, and it defines it as a generally repeatable solution to commonly occurring software problems in software design. And the takeaway from that definition, why I included that here, is I'm going to show these patterns in the context of a little photo gallery application. And the idea is those patterns, they're applied to that application, but they can be, the concepts can be taken and pretty universally applied to a broad range of applications, specifically the applications that you're working on. So there's lots of categories of patterns. Depending on who you ask, they might get categorized differently. So this is a purely subjective, my own sort of bucketization of patterns into two patterns that I'll be covering today. Coincidentally enough. One sort of core patterns or foundational patterns, things like how you separate your code and your script, or content and script, how you structure your application, how do you access data from your server, how do you access data from other services, how does the application architecture kind of work out. And the sort of unifying thing, the reason why I bucket them as foundational patterns is because they're typically all happening behind the scenes. The user doesn't need to know about them. They're more for the web developer and designer to think about. The second category is user experience patterns, and these are things that manifest themselves to the user, things that the user can kind of feel and see happening, and they're in the forefront. So I'll talk a little bit about both kinds of patterns today and cover a few of each. So let's first look at the photo gallery application. Those who've seen my blog or come to my past talks know that I'm also equally interested in photography, and so sort of as a natural sort of confluence of things. So I have this photo gallery application. It's using it's bringing down photos from my site and displaying them in this viewer here, and the big announcement today is Silverlight. So I'm using actually Silverlight in the context of this AJAX application to display my photos and actually have some interesting sort of transition effects. That didn't quite work out as well as I hoped, but there you go. So some interesting transition effects as opposed to just a sort of picture one, picture two kind of jagged kind of transition. You can also see at play here, I have Flickr photos. And so what I'm doing is going out, making a web service call to Flickr, and bringing in some interesting content. So I have a certain set of photos, but Flickr has this several orders of magnitude bigger set of photos there. So I'm doing a query there for the top 20 interesting photos. So using the whole community aspect of that data that's over there. And bringing some pictures that are related to the pictures that I'm showing from my own site. So that's a little bit of Flickr. One thing you might have noticed is the back button actually got enabled as I was doing these. And what I've done is brought back some of the back button behavior that people are used to in a browser, but seem to have lost with a number of AJAX applications. So when I click back, you'll see it went back there. Went back to the previous photo. And all of this is obviously happening while I'm on the same page. There's no actual navigation happening. I can go ahead and also use this Silverlight control here to actually do interesting sort of interesting autoplay slideshow. So I can mix in audio as well, right? And just create a better immersive experience in the context of my AJAX application. So let me pause that. So this Silverlight control is actually sort of a teaser. I'm actually going to have a second talk tomorrow on writing AJAX controls with Silverlight, and I'll kind of dissect this piece. For this talk, I'm going to be talking about some of the patterns you saw here, like the history. One other pattern is, for example, when I enter in a comment, and I press submit, you'll see the page scrolled to show what changed. There was a highlight animation. So this kind of think about when you're creating dynamic user interfaces, how do you tell the user what changed? So that's sort of another pattern at play here. And the last thing I want to show here that, let me actually start fresh without any history. Let's actually turn off JavaScript and refresh this page. And what you'll see is this page is completely functional well. So the images are kind of scaled down just so that they fit on this page. But the idea is this page is fully functional without script. I can click on, for example, a tag here. This will navigate, and show pictures, scope to that tag that I just picked. The comment form just works. All of the functionality just works when script is disabled. And we'll look at that a little bit more about why that's interesting beyond just script disabled environments as we kind of drill in. So this is the application that brings together some of these patterns, and I'll walk you through these in a sort of more sort of individual fashion. So let's switch back to slides for just a second. So I described some of the patterns that were at play here. Just to recap, first and foremost, this was sort of an implied pattern about how you brought script into this page to make it more interactive, make it more immersive. So that's the first pattern. Logical navigation is sort of a fancy name or a fancy term for what's otherwise known as fixing the back button. And providing, but beyond that, providing actually optimal back-forward behavior, as well as bookmarkability. The pattern to display what changed on the page, to highlight it and give the user some feedback, that's another pattern, the update indicator. Another pattern at play is how data is accessed, as well as support in an AJAX manner that supports indexability. And that's tied to the script disabled sort of demo that I just did. And finally, the act of bringing photos from Flickr to enhance my content is sort of a mashup scenario. So let's look first and foremost at bringing script into the picture, because a lot of these things will all be based on script. So let me close this page and bring up. So a lot of scripting still is done in a sort of ad hoc manner, where script and content are all sort of interspersed. They're kind of glued together. They're hard to separate. What you might see is a page, something like this, where this page implements an accordion control. Supposed to implement an accordion control. Oh, thank you. I guess it remembers. Well, you can see it's still functional. All the content's visible, right? And now when a script is enabled, it's behaving more like an accordion. It behaves like an accordion. But the more interesting point here that I want to make is you'll see in the code what I have is an onload handler, various on-click handlers interspersed in the content. And this is still fairly prevalent. So if you were to ever want to go and change the behavior or add to how the accordion behaves, this has become a nightmare, especially if you consider the developer and designer working together. This is they're butting heads essentially. So let's look at how that might be better. So first of all, ASP.NET, I'm going to, in ASP.NET AJAX, there's a script manager control. And I'm actually just going to copy this just so that I don't run out of time. So here's the script manager control. Think of the script manager as sort of the brains behind an AJAX page, manages all the scripts that are going to go into the page. And what I'll do is bring in a JavaScript file called the accordion.js, and that's the implementation of the accordion control. And we'll look at that in just a bit. What I'll go ahead and do now, notice the body doesn't have the onload handler. None of the content actually has script or event handlers. So it's pure content. And what I'm going to do is instantiate a script component and attach it to the HTML DOM. So essentially what I'm doing is creating, this is a shortcut for creating a component in ASP.NET AJAX. And this is the control. This doesn't have any state for now. It's a very simple control, just makes the content an accordion. And this is what it's going to be attached to, content panel. So if you look at the DOM, there's a div with ID content panel. And the way this accordion control works is it essentially looks at each child of this div as an accordion pane. Each child, the first child of that as the header, and the second child of that as the actual content. And now you can go and change the content and do all sorts of things without changing the script itself. So let's look at this working and just make sure it behaves like that accordion in the other sample. So same thing here, nothing special. So let's look at the accordion script itself. So quick show of hands, how many people have played with the ASP.NET AJAX, looked at behaviors, the script library? Okay, fair amount of people, folks. So this is probably looking familiar at this point. Essentially, I've defined namespace to sort of scope out my code. I've implemented a class called accordion. All the way at the bottom, the accordion class derives from behavior. So we have a concept in ASP.NET AJAX called behavior. And the reason why we named it behavior is think of it as a way of associating script behavior with an HTML DOM element. What I'll go ahead and do in this behavior is implement the initialize method. And this is where those semantics of, treat every child. So I'm iterating through the child nodes, treating every child as an accordion pane, drilling into that and treating the first child as a header and the second child as the content. And this is sort of fairly, straightforward script. But the more interesting thing here, what I'm going ahead and doing is attaching this event handler click. So if you remember from that first sample, I had on-click handlers in my page interspersed. So this is the equivalent. And so this might look like you've essentially done a bunch of script to kind of do something that was very simple before. And I'll show you why this is actually more useful as the next step. So this is the script. When the click handlers is invoked, whenever the accordion header is clicked, I'm updating the current view. Essentially, I'm changing the height of the different panes to show and hide content. So this is a very simple accordion right now. So what I can now do, as I said, I spent a bunch of effort writing this class, abstracting my script away from my content. What's the value in doing that beyond just taking script out of the page? So let's look at the next sample. What I'm going to do is switch this to a different accordion implementation. So the way I'll do that is, for now, I'll just change the script reference. But in reality, you'll probably update the accordion control itself to a new version of the accordion control. And let's look at what this does. So now you can see what I just did without changing any of the content, just by changing my script. I've essentially got some animation behavior in this. So that's really the key behind what's the value. The idea is that you can independently iterate on your script and it's all encapsulated, so you don't have to worry about, have I updated everything I need to update. So let's look at accordion slide.js just to kind of see what it does differently. It actually is almost identical. The only thing it does, if you remember, the update logic in the old one was essentially changing the height of the different panes to hide and show content. What I've done here now, instead of immediately updating the height, I essentially go ahead and create this animation, a slide effect, and then call play on the animation. And what play is going to do is it's going to interpolate smoothly so that it doesn't feel like a jerky animation. It's going to accelerate, progress, decelerate. So you're going to have a nice animation effect that eases in, eases out. And essentially in that tween method of the animation, it's changing the height incrementally. So I've essentially done all this without affecting the rest of my page. So that, I think, is fairly valuable. Let's look at another sort of value point. So if I go back to my page, essentially I am putting out my script references manually. I am creating this little bit of script here to go ahead and attach that script to my content. I'm doing that manually. And there's a wide class of developers that really don't want to do that. They don't want to write JavaScript. They'd much rather prefer using server controls. So now that I have this JavaScript class, I can very easily wrap that into a server control. So let's look at that. So I have the script manager on the page. I don't need to manually put out the script references because the server control is going to put that script reference out. And essentially, I've written a demo accordion control, run at equals server, target control equals content panel. Essentially, what we have in ASP.NET AJAX is the concept of extender controls that can allow you to essentially implement the same behavior-like semantics that I just did for the HTML DOM on the server. So what I've done now is put this control. Let's run this. Same behavior. If you look at the source, it generated. Down towards the bottom you'll see the same kind of thing, $create with the same type and the same HTML DOM element. So essentially, the server control is wrapping this, but in addition to wrapping this, it's actually providing a server object model. You could, for example, have events on this accordion that can be handled on the server, or you can have properties like, I have a duration property, for example, to control the length of the animation. So those are examples of why you want to package your script and think about attaching it to the HTML DOM instead of interspersing it. And things like the accordion control, tomorrow there's a talk on AJAX Control Toolkit where the talk will actually delve into looking at some of the details of writing server controls that use AJAX. So let's go back to slides. So this is just a recap slide. The key concepts here are, think about how you separate your content and your script, and sort of attach them on the fly. One other sort of side benefit is it's probably easier to implement a script-disabled, a site that works in script-disabled environments with this approach because you're not depending on all the script being in place. So the next demo I want to talk about is logical navigation. And that's, adding support for the back button. So let's look at a very traditional page first, where you don't have any of the any AJAX really, and I can enter in a comment, test, and that's the behavior I get. The page refreshed, it's down somewhere here. That's what actually changed. And so with a traditional, postback model, you really can't tell what changed. The entire page just changed, and the browser doesn't know any better. And each page kind of starts from the start. So let's look at. Let's close all these. Let's look at what an AJAX page, and I'll use the same sort of accordion control since we've been looking at it. And here too, you see, the back button still disabled. If I had come actually from some other site into my site, if I click the back button, it would leave the application, go all the way back to the previous site. So this is a fairly common problem. Let's look at what I can now do. With the latest release of ASP .NET AJAX, we've actually added a history control that provides a history API. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and add that history control. And it's fairly straightforward server control. You just drop it in, and now your page has the history API enabled. And the next step is to actually use it. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to use this accordion control, which I'm going to use the one that supports history. It also happens to use that slide effect, so let me add the animation. And I'm going to give it a history ID. Let's just give it a paragraph, the paragraph number. So the history ID is basically a key, and you're going to have different values for the paragraph depending on which view you're looking at. So let's look at this running. So when I click that, some state was added to the comment, the stuff after the hash mark in the URL. So you're not navigating to a different page, but you're changing what's on the address bar. I can do that again, and this will change to a different value. So now when I click back, this is essentially navigating back through that state. And what's happening is, as that state changes, various events are raised that can be handled by the code, and the code can then go ahead and switch the view. And we'll look at that in just a bit. What I can also do is go ahead and, for example, save that as a bookmark. And now I'll go ahead and open it up in IE. And you'll see the state was restored. So I can go ahead and bookmark this, send it around an email to whatever. And when that link is clicked, the right view will show up. So let's look at accordion.js just to kind of see a flavor for what the history API looks like. And here's another example. I added history to this accordion control without really changing the page. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, the first thing I'm going to do is add a property for the history ID, and I'm going to just hold on to that and use that as the key into the state in the URL. In my initialize, where this control, when this accordion behavior is instantiated, what I'm going to go ahead and do is, if there's a history ID, then I'm going to go ahead and register a navigation handler with the application.history object. So when you enable history, there's a history API that's added to the application object, and essentially I'm passing in my navigation handler, and we'll see what happens. But before we get to that, let's actually add some state. So in the same update method where I'm switching, which view's visible, what I'm also doing is, if the switch happened because of a user action, not a programmatic call, and history is enabled, I'm going to go ahead and create some history state. Specifically, the state will contain a key that's the history ID and the index of the view that I'm navigating to. So that's all the state I'm tracking. And keep in mind, this is not the state, the in-memory state of your running application. This is a little bit of state that you need to restore a view. You need to think about the bookmarkability scenario where all the state needs to be encapsulated into that bookmark that you need to restore the view. So it's really about defining what are the logical views in your application and an identifier that associates those different views. So now that I have this state, I'm going to go ahead and call add history point on this history API. And the framework that we just introduced with ASP.NET AJAX will take care of all the details of how this works in terms of updating the URL. So now, once that state's on the URL, now the user can actually click back forward, can restore a bookmark. And when that happens, my event handler gets called that I registered for the navigation event. In that event handler, I'm going to go ahead and get the state. I'm going to pick out the state that's meaningful for this particular control. Keep in mind there might be multiple controls on the page that all contribute to history. And then I'm going to go ahead and check if there really was a change for this particular control. So if the index in the state is different than the current view index, then I'm going to go ahead and set the view index, which updates the view to the view that was just selected. So essentially, the history API works by controls adding history state, which updates the URL, and then when the user navigates around, history events are raised, which these controls handle to determine if anything needs to be changed about the UI. So the question was, is there any iframe involved? And the answer is yes, but conditionally, different browsers work differently in terms of how you implement history. In Internet Explorer, we use an iframe. That's what creates the navigation stack, versus in Firefox, for example, updating the hash mark creates history entries. So we're conditionally doing all of that behind the scenes behind this API. So this is actually we're calling the ASP.NET AJAX Futures. A new version of that was actually just released today. And this is a feature in there. So I have a reference to that at the end. Okay, let's go back and look at the recap. So first and foremost, the key thing is to define the logical views in the application. In this simple sample, that all I had was accordion. Each pane is a view. You might, for example, if you have an online mail application, the inbox view, the calendar view, those are all kinds of views, logical views. In my photo gallery, the accordion was the view, as well as each picture was a logical view. So it really depends on your application what a logical view is. But the whole point is now you have control over what adds to history and what does not add to history. And one key point is not every postback needs to go into history. So, for example, when I submit a comment, that doesn't need to add history state. Versus in a regular traditional postback page, every time I press submit, there's a new history added because the browser just refreshed the page. That may or may not be what you want, depending on your application, because if I go back, I essentially have now a form that's filled, and the data in the page isn't actually representative of the reality. So you can now actually override that behavior. The browser is essentially not adding any history, so you kind of have a clean slate to start with, and now you can add exactly what you want into the history stack. So let's keep going. Let's look at the update, providing some user feedback, some gestures to actually indicate what got updated in a page. Again, I'm going to start with a traditional postback page, just to kind of really reiterate how the common sort of discussion around AJAX is, hey, it breaks a bunch of things, like the back button. It broke the back button, or it breaks sort of the model of like you can't really tell what changed. I actually look at that in a slightly different way, in the sense that you have now a clean slate to start with, and you can actually provide a better model than the previous postback model with AJAX. So again, if I just enter in some comment here, there's no feedback, absolutely none, right? If I use update panels, so since most of you have actually looked at ASP.NET, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Essentially, what I can do is wrap my content into update panel controls, and now without any script, I can define what portions of my page change in response to what actions. So I've put a update panel around the form that's used to submit comments, and I've put an update panel around the repeater control that's used to display the list of comments. So this is what you can do with ASP.NET AJAX today. Again, let's just go through this. Same behavior. the comment gets added, but nothing got displayed. And so what I've done is actually prototyped a control that will hopefully be in ASP.NET AJAX in a future release called the update indicator control. It's the same page, update panels around these controls. What I'm going to go ahead and do in here is add this update indicator control that I wrote. I'm going to go ahead and add this inside each of the repeater items. Each repeater item is used to display a single comment, and I'm going to go ahead and add that inside each comment item. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is when the repeater gets data bound, which it happens to get after a comment is inserted. So here's the sequence of things. A comment gets submitted. That comment gets pushed out into the database by virtue of this object data source that I'm using that has an insert method called add comment. So the details of how comments are added is not really important. Essentially, the comment gets added to the database. And since the data changed, essentially, the repeater is redata bound, so it displays the new comment. And the way the comment system works right now for the demo is it's always the last comment that was just recently added. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is when the repeater gets data bound, if I'm in a postback where, as in like a comment was submitted, I'm going to fetch the last item and scroll to it as well as highlight it. And essentially this control, update indicator, is going to emit some script that will scroll to that item as well as highlight it, and we'll see how it does that. So let's look at this running. So let's add test. Does this show up better? And you'll see it scrolled all the way to the bottom, highlighted it. So the key thing is, obviously if you've got multiple portions of a page updating, you have to kind of be selective about how you actually display what updated. For example, you really can't scroll to two different things. You have to pick which is the most important thing. You can certainly highlight multiple things, but it might become an annoyance if you're highlighting something here or highlighting something there. In general, this isn't a problem because you're not updating page just by itself. Some user action was performed which caused the page to be updated. And so there's a certain thing that the user is expecting. And as long as you match those, this doesn't tend to be a problem. You do want to keep the animations down to like a small duration. Generally, what I've found is you might pick a duration. Let's say I pick 2 seconds. Looks great for a demo. Works great for experimenting. Does this kind of get the right feel? But try to imagine yourself working with this application for real and seeing a 2-second kind of animation every time you do something. So general rule of thumb I found that works pretty well is pick a duration that works well for the demo, and then for actually putting it into an actual running app, half it at least. And so it reduces the annoyance factor. So let's look at really quickly what this update indicator control is doing. Essentially, this is another behavior. So, there you go, drives update indicator, derives from behavior. And what it has are two properties, highlight and scroll. So you can choose whether to scroll or whether to highlight. And essentially what it does in its initialize, which is when the new content has been added to the page and the update indicators for that content have been created in response to a postback, this method gets to do its job. And what I'm doing here is creating an instance of update effect, which is an animation, and playing that. I'm telling the animation where to scroll to. And as you can see in this, it's a similar kind of animation as I had previously for the slide. In the tween method, essentially, for the first quarter of the duration, I'm scrolling. So essentially, I'm incrementally scrolling, so it looks like a smooth scroll. And then for the remainder of the duration, I'm highlighting. And essentially, I'm highlighting by changing the background color. But there are several ways to do highlighting. So anyway, the key idea here is to use a subtle animation to kind of show the user what's happening in the page and what updated. For example, if I didn't scroll but just highlighted, the content that you're highlighting might actually not be visible. So think about what's the best way to show what updated. And scrolling and highlighting are a couple examples. Other examples include setting focus. If you expect the user to want to be able to do something immediately, maybe focus is the right thing. It all depends on usability testing of what the right gestures are. Something that works for one application might not work for another application. So as I said, there are various kinds of user gestures. One important one that I didn't actually show that's been fairly covered in the past is progress. When I submit a comment, you might actually want a progress indicator right next to the comment submit button that something's happening. You might want to disable the submit button so that you don't get duplicate submits, for example. So these are all user gestures to indicate something's happening in the page, and when something happens, you can kind of tell them what happened. In addition to guiding the user, it kind of gives you this extra level of polish. If you have a designer kind of person who actually understands these animations, what works, what doesn't work, you can actually get a fairly good kind of experience. And again, as I said, I look at this as a way of AJAX providing you a way of creating better applications. It's not that AJAX just breaks an existing pattern. It actually gives you a way to implement the pattern in a more sort of meaningful way based on your application. There is an update animation control in the AJAX control toolkit already available that kind of does things like animate the updates to each update panel. And as I said, the update indicator is more of a prototype that I wrote up and hope that it'll be in the product at some future release. So do provide feedback when you kind of get a chance to kind of go through this. The code will be all online, and that goes for everything else as well. A lot of these patterns are sort of exploratory thinking. As is this one in particular. So smart data access. I don't actually have a good name for this pattern. This is something that I just cooked up. But the idea is you want to fetch data in an AJAX application using web services or JSON calls, whatever have you, using XML HTTP. But you also want indexability. That's key. That's really something that you can't sacrifice. So let's look at this. I showed you the photo gallery with script disabled. Let me run that again. Let's close some of these. Anytime? Now? All right. And let's disable script again. Hopefully I won't forget, though, this time. So how is this working? Let's look at the page source. What was actually generated by the slideshow control on the server? So essentially, this is the content that's being generated. There's an embed tag. That's the Silverlight plugin. There's a script tag that has a document.write with a div style display none. And then there's all of the content, the span with all of the HTML content for the images and the text associated with the images. And then finally, there is a script tag with the corresponding script tag to write out the end div that was written out by the previous script tag. So to kind of make this clear, I have a smaller version sort of extracted out. So you can see over here, essentially, I have divs, display none, the actual content, and then end div. What's happening here is the server control, the slideshow control. Let me actually show you that because I haven't done that yet. So I have a slideshow control. It has things like the XAML file that's being used to display the server control. But the interesting thing, it also has an item template. It's actually a repeater control in ASP.NET. So the item template contains an image control, a label control, and that's what's used to output the HTML version of the slideshow. In addition to rendering out just that HTML, those item templates, it's also rendering out this script tag that's used to hide this if script is actually enabled. So let's look at this. In a regular browser, when script is enabled, this will actually execute. and we'll write out a div with display none, right? So all of this content is actually hidden away. And then we'll end that div. And so that content is actually not visible in a regular browser. And then we'll have some script that will go ahead and create the alternate representation in a more sort of AJAX-y manner, right? And so now let's imagine what happens when script is actually disabled. Well, so this doesn't get to run. So you're actually going to see the span with the slideshow with all the templates. And this script doesn't get to run. Neither does this script. So essentially what you have is you don't have the slideshow experience, but you have all the content. The idea behind this whole pattern is using HTML as the content model. You're using sort of semantic markup. If you have headers, you use headers. If you have images, you use images. Links are links. So, and this is fairly well understood. I mean, this is exactly what's understood by crawlers. So you've got all your indexability, essentially. So you might be wondering, okay, well, so I fetched, n number of images, but a common scenario is paging. So I might have, a few pages of data as well, and that's a fairly common thing. I might not want to navigate to get each page of data. I might want to actually make a XML call, get the data, show the data. So how might that work? So let's go ahead and re-enable script. Okay. What I'm going to go ahead and do is show you a simple page that kind of shows this. So essentially, I have a simple version of that same page. It's got the same thing here, where it's fetched the first page worth of data as actual regular HTML content. But in addition, it also has this script here. Let me show that in VS so the font's bigger. Whenever a tag is clicked, think of that as paging, page 1, 2, 3, 4. It could also be tag 1, tag 2, tag 3, tag 4. Whenever a tag is clicked, I'm going to go ahead and create a web request, essentially an XML request, fetch the list of photos for that tag, and listen for the completed event. In the completed event, I'm going to go ahead and get the data and pass it on to the slideshow. So essentially, I'm doing a very sort of typical AJAX kind of call. So as you might expect, when I click on a tag, it makes that call, fetches the data, shows it in the slideshow. And so this is working, as you'd expect, in a sort of interactive user session. So these pages of data, though, are interesting for indexability. And so you want to couple this pattern with a sitemap. So I can implement a sitemap, and this is yet another new feature in the ASP.NET AJAX features that's been released today, the ability to generate sitemaps from data. So essentially, I have a sitemap that lists the tags. And if I follow that sitemap, as a search engine might, the crawler, you can see each of these show up as URLs. And then what I can go ahead and do is, let's say I pick the Las Vegas one. Go back to this page. And you can see essentially what happens is the page gets sent with the Las Vegas data, essentially what a search engine would expect to see for that particular URL. So the sitemaps feature is going to be discussed in much more detail in a talk on Wednesday morning. There's a lot of options around sitemaps and more sort of details around how you might want to use sitemaps. But this kind of shows you how you can do AJAX-like data access without losing indexability. And if there's feedback on this, I'd love to hear it because, as I said, I just essentially cooked this up over the last couple of weeks. I'd love to hear if there are issues with this and how this could be, a basis of something bigger. So let's look at, how am I doing on time? Let's look at the recap on that to see if there's something interesting that I forgot to tell. So the key idea here, the summary kind of idea, is to use HTML as the content format. HTML has a lot of semantic concepts associated with different tags, and the idea is to actually use that to represent your data model that is interesting for for a search engine to get the indexability you need for your app. The other thing is that the other thing this actually gives you the benefit of is the first page that you request didn't have to go make an AJAX request back to the server to fetch the first page of data. You use the same network connection to send both your application as well as your data embedded inside that page. So for the second page, you are making an AJAX request to go get the second page worth of photos, but you saved one network request for that initial page. So that's a key thing, both from a number of connections perspective, as well as you don't have to send a page that's empty and tell the user loading, let me get the first page of data. So it's overall goodness. In terms of how ASP.NET AJAX ASP.NET more specifically adds value here, this is really looking at how AJAX can be much better with an intelligent server. It's not just about serving up HTML pages and script. It's about intelligently serving up the initial HTML. And this is where a server really adds value in the AJAX sort of space. And combined with that, I'm actually using data-bound control. So I had the slideshow hooked up to an object data source, and that sort of is another key thing. So the next thing I want to talk is just about doing a mashup. There are different ways of doing it, and I just want to show a couple of ways to do it, and an extensibility point that ASP.NET AJAX offers along the way. So just like the photo gallery, I'm going to be using Flickr. So essentially, the first and more prevalent model is to use a server-side proxy. Essentially, the client-side script on in your HTML page makes a call back to the server, and the server then makes a call to Flickr, sends the data, and hands it back to the client. And the first and foremost reason why people do that is to work around the cross-domain limitations. Your app on myapp.com can't make a cross-domain call to flickr.com. So the server-side proxy is a workaround in some sense. But let me just show this to you, and I'll tell you why it's not just a workaround. There's also some interesting uses for that model. So let me actually load this in IE. Just so that I can show an HTTP tracing tool, just to see the request going out. So I'm going to go ahead and click this link, and it's going to go make that request to Flickr, bring back some pictures via the server. So it brought back a picture. Oh, and I didn't click Enable Logging. So there you go. There's the request. And essentially, I made a request to, let me copy this URL. Essentially, I made a request back to my own server to a service that I have on my server, Flickr proxy.ashx, passing in some data, and the server is going to go make the call. The data I got back looks like a JSON object graph. It's an array of pictures. Each has a title. Each has a URL. And this isn't exactly what Flickr returned, but this is what the server-side proxy returned. And so there are a couple of uses for the server-side proxy. One is to actually transform the data or pre-process the data you got from a service so that it's more suitable for your client application. Flickr sends a lot of data for each picture, which I don't need for this simple little application. So to minimize what the client-side script in my application is doing, I can do some additional work on the server. I can also do things like use configuration. For example, looking at this Flickr proxy implementation. Every time you make a call to Flickr, you need an API key so that they can track which application is calling it. And so what I've done in my code is actually use app settings and put the Flickr API key into web.config so that that can be changed without changing the code. So one of the key things here is imagine you had cross-domain capability on the client. I'd claim this is still interesting for certain set of service or mashup scenarios because you might never want to ship your API key to the client. So the proxy model is still interesting in its own way. You might actually want to do throttling or caching on your server. For example, if you look at weather.com's agreement when you register for an API key, they tell you it's advisable not to call the service every so often, that you should call it every half an hour. So your server might actually cache some data. So imagine you had a portal application and lots of users ask for weather for the same zip code. There's no reason to go to weather.com every time and kind of use your API key for that. So you can kind of do server-side caching, server-side throttling, and the proxy, the mashup sort of done using a server-side proxy enables you to do these things. So at the same time, there's a cost to doing this, obviously, which is why cross-domain access is actually interesting to people. You're using your server-side bandwidth, essentially, and you're also suffering from a greater degree of latency. You're making one call to your server, and your server is making a call to Flickr. So when possible, you want to think about, are there some other options? And so various services have started offering what they call JSON-P, and I'll show you what that is. So it's the same page, but instead of making a call to my server, I'm going to be making a call to Flickr directly. But what I'm also going to tell it is I want the format of the response to be JSON, and I'm also going to give it a callback to call with the data. So let me actually show this working. It'll be more clearer once I do that. So I'll clear this log so we can see what's going on now. So it's the same functionality. I'll show random pictures. I get back the same data. But this time around, the URL is to Flickr with the API key and all of that on the client. Format is JSON, and then there's a callback saying, when the data comes back, go ahead and call this callback. And the way this works is you essentially create a script tag in the page, set its source to this URL, and the data coming back is JSON surrounded with the callback. And I'll show you the response. So it's this response, which I'll copy into Notepad so it can be read. So as you saw, the callback was __ SE callback 0. And that's what shows up here. So this is the regular JSON data, but surrounded by a callback function, which the application defined. And so when the script runs, it essentially calls this callback with the JSON data, and essentially you've achieved cross-domain. You made a cross-domain call. Certain services support it, things like Delicious, Flickr, and the name of the model is called JSON-P. So let me show you how ASP.NET AJAX actually provides an extensibility model so you can go do this. So if I were doing a regular XML HTTP call back to my server, I'd use either the sys.net.webRequest class, or I'd use a web service proxy. But here what I'm doing is, in addition to setting the URL, what I'm also doing is setting this executor, which is a sort of an advanced property. Think of it as a way the web request framework that we have in ASP.NET AJAX allows you to plug in different transports. The default, for example, is the XML HTTP executor. What I've gone ahead and done here for this demo is built a sample called the script executor. And let's look at that. So first of all, I bring it into the page by including a JavaScript file, scriptexecutor.js. And this is a class that derives from web request executor. So by deriving from web request executor, it can now plug into the web request sort of framework. And the key method here, there are a couple of key methods. The first one is execute request, which is where the executor does its work. In the case of XML HTTP, the default executor we ship in the framework news up an XML HTTP object, sets up its ready state listener, and then calls open and then send to go make the request. What I'm going to go ahead and do here is create a callback function. This is where that __se callback comes from. Use a count to create a unique name for each request. Set that up as a function that's global so that the response can actually go call this method. And then I'm appending this JSON callback where I tell the service what callback to go ahead and use. The next thing I go ahead and do is create a script element, set its type to be JavaScript, set the source to be that URL, and add that script element to my document. If there's a timeout, I go ahead and implement timeout semantics. That's sort of orthogonal. What essentially happens is I'm using this method on object available as my callback method. So when the on object available gets called, it's passed in the object. Remember, the callback was passed in the JSON data as part of the parameters. So that's the object. That's essentially the data. So I hold on to that, perform any cleanup, and raise the completed event. At which point, the ASP.NET your application code's completed gets called. That's my executor, where I call getObject, and that object is returned out. So all of this code is actually exactly what I would write for the XML HTTP executor. The only one-line difference I've added here is setting the executor to the script executor. And just for the sake of completeness, this is sort of a well-behaved thing in the sense that it implements dispose. So if either it times out or you're shutting down the page before the response comes back, it's going to go ahead and do the cleanup. And in the cleanup, what I go ahead and do is, amongst a few things, I go ahead and remove the script element from the document. This helps, especially in the debugger scenario, because your Script Explorer window doesn't keep growing with script elements. It takes it out. So this kind of shows the ability to plug in different ways of doing HTTP calls from ASP.NET AJAX. So to recap on that, the key thing here is to think about what's the right way to access a service. Just because a service can be accessed cross-domain doesn't imply that that's the best way to do it. There's scenarios for using a proxy on the server. There's scenarios where you might want to actually do a cross-domain call. JSONP is one way of doing cross-domain calls. There are some other ways as well. The service actually needs to support it. So an arbitrary service cannot be called using JSONP. So it doesn't. The person implementing the service has to consciously opt into it, which is goodness. There's an implied trust in this model. When I'm writing my application, I'm trusting Flickr to do the right thing. I'm trusting Flickr is actually going to send the right data, that it's safe JSON, there's no script, it's actually just data. So there's an implied trust. But that comes with any sort of mashup. The fact that I'm calling into an API that someone else is providing implies a certain level of trust. I wouldn't do that whether it's on the server or from the client if I didn't trust the site. And last thing I wanted to show here was how the networking stack is actually extensible and pluggable. So there are lots of patterns. You could go on and on forever. One thing I mentioned early on was the slideshow was actually implemented using Silverlight. That's an example of a pattern in a sense that you might find you want to do certain things and go beyond the capabilities of HTML in the browser, and in that sense, you're using a browser plugin. And the key idea for tomorrow's talk is about how you can actually do that in a natural way so it plugs into the rest of your AJAX application. Another key pattern that you want to be thinking about is diagnostics. Lots of code is running on the client. typically when you have code running on the server, you have all sorts of ways of monitoring what's happening, recording exceptions, recording errors, so that you can actually go ahead and do something about them once they're logged. And with AJAX applications, lots of stuff is happening on the client. So you want to think about how you actually capture that data in the case of errors. And we have, I didn't delve into this, but we have a diagnostics control in the ASP.NET AJAX Futures release as well that was released today. It's a very initial basic implementation. It lets you capture things like what the error was and line number information and stuff like that. But you can imagine that that can be enhanced with more information about what the browser was and different aspects about the runtime environment that are interesting to that application to track. There's discussion of patterns on different websites. AJAXpatterns.org has a list of them. The Yahoo Design Patterns site is fairly extensive in terms of UI, mostly UI-related patterns that you might want to check out. I mentioned a few of these. The first one is more of a drill down into ASP.NET AJAX features. There's a talk on AJAX Control Toolkit where part of that talk also delves into writing some controls. I mentioned the search talk in conjunction with the sitemap demo. That's on Wednesday. And to reiterate, the Dev 05 is my talk tomorrow morning on writing ASP.NET AJAX controls with Silverlight. Resources. Your first stop is basically ajax.asp.net for everything ASP.NET AJAX related, essentially, from downloading the bits that were released today to participating in the community. The Control Toolkit is actually an open source community project on Codeplex and currently has at least 30 controls, last time I counted. So that's another sort of great thing to go check out in terms of the ready-made solutions available to you. There are a number of blogs, including my own, that you might want to check out. In summary, the idea is to think about your application, think about what the problems are and interesting ways to solve it, keeping in mind that there are some problems that AJAX brings that can be solved. There are some problems that AJAX actually helps solving better. And then, obviously, it goes without saying, check out ASP.NET AJAX. It's a great platform for building these solutions and getting you started. So with that, do fill out the evals after this session. And I have some time for Q&A, I guess. I have about 15 minutes, so go ahead and, ask. Go ahead. So the question is around my own projects, prototypes, ideas, some controls I released earlier that were actually written in Script Sharp. For those who don't know, Script Sharp is basically a project that I'm doing that allows me to write code in C# converted to JavaScript. And I initially wrote a lot of the update controls using that model. And the initial release had both systems working together, Script Sharp and ASP.NET AJAX. That's actually been changed. They're all built on top of ASP.NET AJAX now. It doesn't have a duplicate type system. And the way that it happened is I have a version of Script Sharp that's not yet released, still kind of being polished, that actually works directly on top of ASP.NET AJAX. That will be announced on my blog as soon as I get some time. So the question is around performance with multiple extenders being created, especially in repeated scenarios. It's hard to kind of make a blanket statement on performance. I mean, I can certainly see some problems if you have, let's say, a few thousand extenders. You'll probably run into some perf problems there. If you have, let's say, 100, I don't personally anticipate a perf problem, but it all depends on what the application is doing. So obviously measure is sort of the first point. The second point is check out another addition to the futures CTP that we put out today. There's the ability to go find elements based on a CSS query. So you can go find all elements with a certain CSS class and go create a behavior for all elements matching. What that saves is you're still creating n number of behaviors at the end of the day, but it's saving up some of the lookups that might cause add to the time taken. So check that out. Doesn't have an extender control counterpart, so to speak, yet, but check that out. I'll take that question actually.
I guess almost a follow-up to that question in terms of performance. I found that the update control panel itself is a little chatty or not optimal in terms of bandwidth usage. Is there any plans of optimizing that in the future or anything like that?
That was suddenly loud. So the question is around update panel chattiness or not as optimized. When you use update panels, you want to think about how what portions of your page update in response to what. So if you look at this particular sample here, this update panel has update mode equals conditional. So that's the first thing you want to think about. By default, it's always. That's the default. So any update panel that has always updates on every request, and so your response size gets larger. Setting it to conditional is the first step in terms of looking at specifically when it should update in response to what user actions. At that point, if you still find too many parts of your page being updated, you want to kind of look at the design of your page itself. Like, which parts do you actually really need to be updated for a given user action? And that's more of an application-specific optimization. But you do have to understand update panels are around demarking chunks of your page. You have some control over what parts get updated, and then you have to kind of decide the next step, which is based on your application.
Yes, I noticed after about like 5 or 6 refreshes of an update panel, especially if there's more than one on a page, and you're doing something like lists or grids within that update panel. I noticed it in IE, not so much Firefox, and I'm not sure if it's a bug in there, but I've seen memory paging hit up to 400 meg just for the IE process. Getting that page until it's clear and closed out.
So I've certainly not seen specifically that behavior where it hits 400 megs. It all depends on really what your application is doing. You just said you have update panels inside a grid, and it might be interesting what's inside the grid. For example, in terms of the amount of content you are replacing, keep in mind what's happening is we're taking the old HTML away and putting in some new HTML. So our controls and behaviors, if you follow the pattern, they have a dispose method. So before we tear down the old HTML, we call the dispose method of every one of them. If you have your own script, for example, attached to UI inside those regions that isn't disposing itself, that's not going away until the page is until the browser is closed. So if you have script inside update panels, let me rephrase that. Script attached to HTML elements that are inside update panel regions, you want to think about the dispose logic. In the past with ASP.NET 1.0.2.0, there was a very sort of linear page lifecycle. The page loads, user does something, page posts back, and then the entire page gets refreshed. With update panels, you essentially have this long-lived page that's constantly updating. So you want to think about your dispose logic explicitly. So that's the first thing. The other thing you mentioned that might be something to think about is you said you had update panels inside the grid.
No, the grid's inside an update panel.
Okay. But to kind of finish off that thought, if you find yourself in a situation where you have update panels inside every item of a grid or every row of a grid, think about whether the update models is better if you update the entire grid or whether you update individual items. Think about that as well, to minimize the number of update panels itself. Does that help?
Yeah, it gives me a place to start.
Okay.
Two questions. Is there a way to offload the creation of the extension to a separate JS file? So that when you start using adding the extenders actually to your code, can you offload that to a separate JS file, or does it have to go at the end of the page?
Let me try to understand that question. The question is, if you're using a bunch of extender controls, can you delay the script loading for those extenders, or do they all have to go to the end of the page during load when the page is loaded up?
The output that is generated is going to create message, right?
Yes.
Take that and offload it?
So, answer is sort of yes and no. You can certainly do more work as the page progresses. In the sense you can load script dynamically, you can go call those create methods dynamically. You can certainly do that. What's sort of not really there is when you use server controls, they all send their script up front. You don't have the ability to kind of delay some of that loading. But you get some of that by update panels. For example, let's say you had a accordion control, for example, inside a particular view that isn't initially visible. That script's not going to be sent down. But when you do make that view visible and you have an update panel around it, that script is going to be sent down. So in that sense, it is being loaded on demand. So it depends on the structure of your page, how much it impacts your initial view. What's the second question? So the question, so the question is around if you have lots of DOM elements that are similar, what's the best way? This new API that allows you to attach behaviors to multiple elements, that's certainly a thing. You can certainly also write behaviors that attach themselves to multiple elements, meaning that the behavior itself is, let's say, attached to the body of the document, and internally it goes and attaches events to multiple elements. In fact, the accordion behavior here was attached to the outermost content panel, and it found the headers within that content panel and attached event handlers to all of them. You just have to keep in mind that your dispose logic also needs to detach from all of them.
Yeah, I just didn't know in terms of best practices, is it best to try to traverse through the DOM, or is it better to try to give some kind of a reference to that DOM via either an ID or a class name?
Certainly, if you provide an ID, that's the fastest search. Class names are the next. There are slower searches and faster searches. IDs and class names are certainly much faster compared to, for example, search for all anchors which have an attribute, rel equals tag. That's a fairly slow query compared to search for the anchor named, tag link, for example. Question back there. Actually, go ahead.
I have two kind of related questions. One is on ASP validators, how they don't work client side and update panel, so that the update panel refreshes, you lose all the client side validation.
So questions around validators and them not working inside update panels. There is an update for the validator controls themselves. I don't have the information off the top of my head, but there's a blog post I can point you at that describes it and where you can get the update.
Related to that, notice that inline script does not execute as part of the update panel reload. Is that by design, or is there so you've got inline script?
That's mostly by design because different browsers work differently in terms of when you update content of a DOM region using inner HTML, they have different behavior in terms of I can't remember which browser does what, but between IE, Firefox, and Safari, there were differences enough that was not supported. Definitely not recommended, at least.
Well, I guess in terms of if you had inline script, it seems like you would have already handled those situations in terms of different browsers. So it would be nice if that script would execute.
It certainly would be nice. We actually did a bunch of work to enable all the create calls, for example, to actually happen in an update panel request such that they don't end up in the content of the HTML that's being updated for specifically that reason. So, question up?
I guess on that guy's question, there's that script manager.register startup script that you can fire in the midst of an async postback. That's how we got around that.
Yeah, so if you use the APIs, so to qualify the question, I guess, if you manually place a script tag inside your HTML, that's not going to work. But if you use the APIs on a script manager, we do the work so that it doesn't actually go into the content. We have several pieces of data that gets sent back as a response, and we know that this was a script that you wanted to add. And we handle that separately. And that might be the reason why you're saying it works. It depends on which API or how you add the script.
The other part of this question I had was, is there any precautions that you need to take when messing up the panels to get yourself into trouble doing that?
You shouldn't get yourself into trouble if they're configured correctly. Keep in mind that if you have nested update panels, if an outer panel is being updated, let's say it was conditional, or if the outer panel is being updated, it doesn't matter what the inner panel is, whether it's being updated or not. It's going to be actually rendered out, not as. So if you look at this generated source, you have a div that contains the update panel content, and in an update panel scenario, the contents of the div are updated, not the div itself. If you have a nested update panel and the outermost one is updating, its divs are untouched, its content is touched, which includes the div of the nested update panel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but after you updated the outer one, there's nothing preventing the inner ones from subsequently doing their own update.
Yes, but not in the same request. In any given request, the outermost one will be updated. In a single request, if you have update panel A, which includes update panel B, and both of them have their conditions matching so that they are going to be updated, only A is going to get updated. Not B is just going to look like any other arbitrary HTML content.
You can update B independent of A.
Yes. Go ahead. Well, it's certainly a concern from the perspective that browsers are very different. Beyond just API differences, they're behaviorally different in terms of perf characteristics, for example. And you really have to look at your application, test it out in every browser. There's unfortunately no shortcut around for that particular problem. So I guess I should say, you have to test in every browser for your representative application scenarios, not sort of test scenarios, actual scenarios. And in general, you want to design for minimizing what you do on the client. You don't want to do stuff on the client just for the sake of doing it, is I guess my point. If you have to do it, you just have to do it. That's the point. You have to recognize the browser platform does have limitations in terms of performance or stability. This is actually one of the big reasons why I think Silverlight is very interesting. Does that help? It's not an answer per se. It's more of a thought and where things stand today.
Why can't you guys get together and build a jigsaw puzzle of all browser companies together?
How do you get all browser companies together? Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first. Which request are you talking about? Yeah. The content that was being returned from those requests was JSON. So I'm guessing you're talking about huh. You want to see in the code. So where's the code? So for example, when I click a tag and fetch the list of photos, right? I get my request completed. At that point, I'm getting this object, which is a JSON object graph. It contains an array of pictures, picture information like title and URL for each. And I'm feeding that into the UI. And the Silverlight control is actually making the request for the actual image itself. So all this is sending is the information about the photos, the titles and the URLs. No, I don't have an image tag here itself. The image is actually inside Silverlight itself. I can show you what that looks like, I guess. So here's the XAML that's being loaded into that Silverlight control, and it has an image brush for the two photos, the back photo and the front photo, and the script is programmatically setting the source of these images, image brushes. I'll talk a little bit more about that in my other talk, I guess. But the Silverlight control is making the actual image download. My app is downloading the list of photos. Yeah. Okay, question there? Like I think both Scott and Ray mentioned in the keynote this morning, it's about having the options and then figuring out what your application requirements are and what the right technology is. Ray kind of talked about the two sort of patterns at the two ends of the pattern in the sense universal web applications and experience first kind of applications. Those translate into basically a set of requirements for your application. What are the requirements? What are the technologies that satisfy those requirements? For example, if I was writing a simple sort of media player, like a number of examples that you saw this morning, those are fairly straightforward. They don't require, tons of managed code, for example. Versus if you look at the video editing application that was shown, that's a fairly complex application. And this is where script kind of starts showing problems, not just in terms of perf and scalability and reliability, kind of like the question that was asked here, but also in terms of amount of code, maintainability of the code, how the code's going to evolve, what's the right set of tools for sort of authoring and engineering that code. So there's application requirements, there's development requirements. You kind of want to look at all of those together to figure out what the right technology is. I don't think script itself as a way of writing applications is going away anytime soon. Not at least for the next few years. I don't know, but perhaps I understand what I totally understand what you're getting at in terms of the functionality of that API. I don't know if it's been registered in terms of we're going to do this next version or not. So if you could talk to me offline, I'll send an email to make sure it's on the list, and if it can be done for the next version, it will be done. All right, I think I should say thanks to everyone who's still here for attending. Hope this was useful. And I'll be here for, I think, 5 or so more minutes as I wrap this up. So if there's any offline questions.